My name is Yaffa Rattner, and I'm a Senior Managing Director and Head of Municipal Credit here at HilltopSecurities. I am joined by my partner, Tom Kozlik, and co-author of the survey. And Tom is Head of Public Policy and Municipal Strategy at HilltopSecurities. We're really excited to share this webcast with you this afternoon. For those of you who have not seen the survey, please, you can download the survey results at the HilltopSecurities landing page or under the Insight section. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons and the thought leadership that went into our decision to go ahead and do a public entity survey. As a leading municipal investment banking firm, it was very important to our senior leadership to get a pulse on what some of the employees of the various public entities that we partner with have to say, what's driving them in terms of their issues. And as a result, we moved forward with a 10-question survey that we had open during the spring and early summer of 2024. My partner, Tom Kozlik, who's the Head of Public Policy and Municipal Strategy, and myself, Yaffa Rattner, Head of Municipal Credit at Hilltop, are happy to chat with you about the results of the survey today. Tom, what was your favorite question and findings in the survey?
So I'm going to go to number 3 for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, number 3 is definitely my favorite. And
for those that don't have the survey in front of them, and then ask you, Tom, to share why it was your favorite. So the question is, what are the biggest challenges facing your public entity? Choose up to 4.
So there are a couple of takeaways that I have with this question. The first is that the first thing that I noticed, and maybe this is just because I've been paying such close attention to cyber over the last couple of years, is that I was I was very pleasantly surprised to see that cyber was nationally was recognized as the 4th, I guess I'm going to say, the biggest challenge, because even though it's a challenge, I really like that it's being recognized by folks in the public entity landscape as being something that needs to be addressed. And because it surprises me. I was expecting cyber to be not just lower, not just a notch or 2 lower, but much lower. And so I was very pleasantly surprised to see that cyber, and just coincidentally, it's Cyber Awareness Month in October. But I was very pleasantly surprised to see that cyber was as high as it is.
Where would you have put cyber if you were answering the survey? Would it have been in your top 4? Tom?
For me, I was thinking, for me, I would have had it in the top 4. Yes. I think that I probably would have had pensions higher. But that also, I think that very well depends on the perspective, right? If there are entities where pensions aren't necessarily financially or fiscally challenged, then that's not going to be as big of an issue, right? So I think that maybe one of the reasons that pensions is lower is because of perhaps where some of the people who are answering the survey are from. But to me, I would have had pensions probably in the top 4, with infrastructure and labor. What about you?
Yeah, so I think my number 1 would absolutely be labor challenges. I'm particularly focused on it, because so much of a public entity's budget is going to be driven by labor. I've seen some stats that haven't changed too much over time. Generally speaking, 80 to 85% of a school district's budget is going to labor. at least 60+% of a typical city or municipal budget's going to labor. So as the single largest expense, it's got to be, front and center on everybody's radar screen. And although I saw an article by S&P that was released last week that talked about labor expenses on hospitals moderating, they also talked about that they're moderating at a much higher level. And I think that concept really comes forward in looking at schools and municipals and state governments as well. So I do think that labor is a big challenge that we have for all of our public entities, and it deserves that number one spot as a result. What will be really interesting to me is, as we have the opportunity of doing this survey again in 2025, it'll be interesting to see what the employment environment and landscape will look like at that point, and where this clear number one issue will reside in 2025 when we do the survey again is really anyone's guess.
I would add to that, Yaffa, one of the things that I think that if and when we do this next year, asking, one of the things I know that the age of the workforce, and that's one of the things that we did ask about, that's definitely one of the issues that is on a lot of employees' minds. But one of the other things that I don't recall us asking about is how technology is factoring into that, and especially generative AI, right? That's one of the things that I think would be interested to get some feedback about in the future.
Yeah, I think the technology issue we hit upon just ever so tangentially when we talked about the work from home situation and what percentage of our public entity employees are working from home. So it's a slight technology touch, but I agree with you, looking at AI and the ways in which our public entity employees and partners are using AI is going to be something very, very interesting, and something that we could all learn from, and various different municipalities or school districts can learn from each other. I think it's a great question to add.
Yeah.
And maybe let's talk a minute about the remote work situation, because what I thought was really interesting on question 6, if we may go there, right? The question is, on any given day, what percentage of your team is working remotely, and what is the average of all the responses? So on average, only 20% of employees are working remotely on any given day. And frankly, I think both you and I were surprised by that result. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of our observations with respect to that result, Tom.
Yeah, my first reaction to that, like you said, I was surprised that was so low. But then as I thought about it, I thought, and the conclusion that I came to, there were two things that were really driving that. I think, first of all, that a lot of the folks who participate in the survey are from Texas. And even the Castle Systems data shows that there are less people working remotely or in a hybrid way in the cities in Texas than compared to like Boston, DC, or San Francisco. So when you look at other places outside of Texas, the numbers are a little higher, but they're still not close to the Castle Systems data, right? And so that's one of the things that one of the reasons I think that is because a lot of the people who participate are from Texas. But then I also think that industries matter, and I think that one of the things that I've learned over the last kind of 12 to 18 months is that while there are some government roles that are being done remotely, a lot of government, they have been trying to come back into the office in more of a full-time manner, right? So I think that's one of the other reasons of why it is that we're seeing numbers in the survey like we're seeing.
Yeah, I think my takeaway from the conversation and from the survey is really twofold. One is, as you've articulated, industries really do matter, and two, location matters too. And we're very proud to say that we've received over 1,200 responses, and that our responses came from all of the states in the US, but there's definitely, and maybe we should just point to the map on question 2, but there's definitely some geographic concentration with our responses, right? So we did get the most responses from Texas, Florida, and California. And so super interesting because obviously the 3 most populous states, and we've gotten responses from those in the most significant manner from those 3 states, although clearly from all states. So I just thought that that was a super interesting fact to point out. Maybe it makes sense. I also thought that as a top municipal investment bank, maybe we should talk for a moment or two about question number 4. And question number 4 reads, if you were to issue debt next year, what would be your top priorities? And Tom, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what we found in those results.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was surprised about where 4 was concerned is that schools wasn't higher. Because to me, when that is the area that I would have thought would have been, I mean, it's top 3, but I would have thought schools would have been not just 1 or 2, but 1 or 2. I thought that was going to be number 1. Water and sewer, it's not surprising that water and sewer isn't. It doesn't surprise me that water and sewer is high. I would have thought that would have been in the top, 3 or 4. And it doesn't surprise me that roads and bridges are that high as well. But yeah, the big takeaway that I have from number 4 is that I'm surprised that schools wasn't number 1.
Yeah, I was similarly surprised, and especially, we had a pretty large contingency of Texas school districts that were responding to the survey, and I would have imagined that that would be higher. I also thought that it's interesting, I was thinking about public safety and maybe, surprising that that wasn't higher, similar to how we talked about cybersecurity being so much in the news lately. I know public safety is so much in the news these days as well. And then I reflected, and traditionally public safety isn't a factor that you would issue debt for. So it made sense to me that, frankly, that was lower on the response list.
And I guess, and even as I think about the question number 3, aging infrastructure was the second most important theme, right? So it's interesting to me that aging infrastructure is the second most important theme, and maybe, from that perspective, that's potentially why it is that water and sewer, roads and bridges are 1 and 2 for number 4. I mean, I count schools as aging infrastructure as well. But I think that maybe one of the reasons of why it is that we're seeing the answers in number 4 as what they are is because, and I think that kind of jives with what it is that we see in answer number 3.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think that the American Society of Civil Engineers have ranked various parts of our infrastructure at a D and a C. And it looks like it's areas in which we really do need to have very significant investment in to not only protect this generation, but subsequent generations. And that really dovetails, frankly, with question 10, Tom, because we did end the survey with a conversation with respect to, and I'll read the question, do you believe that your legislative representatives in DC understand the value of the tax exemption for municipal bonds? And, to me, the results were very telling, with over 48% saying not sure, and almost 30% saying no. And I overlay that response with the concept that the GFOA writes, and I quote, if state and local governments lose their ability to issue tax exempt bonds and they're compelled to issue taxable bonds as an alternative, it's estimated that costs of that issuance costs or that debt service is going to increase by about 25% per transaction, and perhaps even more for smaller municipalities. And that's a scary concept when we've already talked about labor costs that could be more than 60% of the budget. You start adding new expenses and you start crowding out any flexibility of government to be able to offer additional services. What's your thought about the potential tax exemption on political agenda in 2025 or beyond?
Yeah, so I'm definitely going to answer that question, but I'd like to mention a couple of other things first. The first thing is that the not sure, the 49% who said they're not sure. I'm kind of putting that in the no category because if they're not sure, then I think that edges more towards the no category. So the results from this uh, are problematic, but not surprising. And the reason for that is because, and I'm going back to the sections that we were just talking about, where we were talking about the importance of infrastructure in question number 3, and the specific things that need to be addressed in question number 4, which is infrastructure, roads, bridges, and schools. And I think that with the infrastructure gap, you mentioned the Society of Civil Engineers, and when you think about the dollar amount of the infrastructure gap that they have been writing about for not just years but decades, to me, from a policy perspective, it doesn't make sense to make it more difficult for state and local governments to try to close that infrastructure gap with potentially eliminating the tax exemption, because that's really what we're talking about. And to answer your specific question, I've written about, and I remain very concerned anytime one of the presidential candidates start talking about the goodies that they'd like to change with regard to tax policy, the things that they'd like to give away, that to me makes it so the threat to the municipal bond tax exemption is that much stronger, because those are the types of things that could crowd out potential spending for infrastructure, potential spending for the tax exemption. And there's going to be I'm not certain that there's going to be an imminent threat to the tax exemption next fall, the fall of 2025, but there's a very strong potential for that to materialize.
And what can we do in the interim, Tom, to the extent that that could materialize?
I think that one of the most important things that folks on the public entity side could do is, exactly what is it the GFOA has been trying to do? They've been trying to educate lawmakers in DC about what it is that the tax exemption is, right? Because, even in my experience going back over the last decade, there are lawmakers in DC, even lawmakers who have spent time at the state and local level, but oftentimes for some reason, when they get into DC, there are so many moving pieces that they seem to forget about what it is that was affecting the state and local government budgets, right? Just as you were alluding to, and what it is that is the priorities at the state and local level. And as we see in the answers to question 3, infrastructure is one of the top issues. And the tax exemption is one of the things that state and local governments, other public entities can use to help close that infrastructure gap.
Yeah, I think your point is spot on. It's just super interesting because too many people think about the tax exemption as an exemption or a resource for the wealthy individual, when in fact the similar or the opposite perspective also needs to be incorporated in the concept that this tax exemption is cost savings for our municipalities and our school districts, and
Right.
many of them can't afford a 25% increase in their borrowing costs and still deliver the services that are so important to their residents in an environment of, as we talked about before, rising labor costs and expenditures that need to fit under a fixed revenue environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really the concepts that I wanted to bring forward in today's survey. Tom, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
I definitely want to talk about, before we end, I definitely think we should talk about who it is that participated, right? You mentioned that there were 1,200 folks that participated in the survey. I think it definitely makes sense for us to highlight, who, the entities that those participants were from.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So we did talk about the geographic distribution and diversity with our responders, but we should definitely talk for a quick moment about who did they ultimately represent. And about 42% represented cities or towns, and another almost 30% represented counties and school districts, with the remainder special districts, states, utilities, and other entities within the market. And I'm really proud of that, right? It's the first annual survey that we did. We covered all states. We had over 1,200 responders, and we had some really good diversity, not only in location, but the entities that our responders represented.
Yeah, I would add to that the folks behind the scenes at Hilltop really worked very hard to get electronic and other responses, and that's, I think that there's a lot of credit that goes into the folks behind the scenes that helped get those numbers as high as they were able to reach.
Yeah, I completely shout out to our Hilltop team that helped us on the survey. Could
Yeah,
not have done it without you
yeah.
guys. You're awesome. And we both look forward to being able to replicate this survey or something very similar to it in late 2025.
Yeah.
With that, I'd like to say thank you again for listening to our webcast this afternoon, and encourage you to reach out to myself or to Tom if you have any questions or follow-up thoughts.